Now we move on to talk about globalization from a carrier's perspective, and we welcome up on stage Juul-Nyholm, who is Managing Director of Maersk Line Scandinavia. Welcome, Christian.
Thank you.
Give him a warm hand as well.
All right, I feel it's almost going to be a repetition of what has already been said, but I will try to make a few additional comments. There it is. This is basically what I want to talk about. There's major shifts in global trade, and I want everybody to be present where it happens. So I only have 10 minutes, so it's will really not justify the whole subject. I'll try to stick to 2 points. One is the shift in the market, the new markets that are coming up. I think all Scandinavian countries or companies need to be there, and I think I don't need to speak to some of the big ones that I've presented, but I think for a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises, there's a need for help also. And I hope we can get back to that in the discussion. The other part is about infrastructure and the necessity of good transportation, because I think this is very important in as much as what's happening in the markets today and what we think will happen in the future will only happen if good infrastructure is in place. Okay, mine doesn't work either, maybe. There we go. This has been mentioned a little bit before, the correlation between GDP growth and trade growth. If we look at the GDP growth over the last 30 years, and what we see coming is really that the developed world has gone from more or less an average of 3% to down to 2 or less. At the same time, we have seen the developing world or the emerging markets coming from a little below 4% to up about 6%. Now, that's a trend that we at least see. I have to stress from our perspective, of course, there are many opinions about this that will continue in the future, and the trade relations that we see in container transportation is that there's roughly a 2 to 3% multiplier that we can apply to global GDP growth that represents the container flows, and that's what we have seen over the last 40 years, except for 2009. So obviously, if we add those two together, that means that we will be focusing on where the big GDP growth is as well. And we estimate, or at least I would say the Asia Development Bank estimates that by 2050, Asia could be 50% of the global economic output. Emerging markets and demographics. Well, what are we really talking about? We're talking about two things, of course. Which are the markets and what are the demographics? This is also one of the things that we spend a lot of time looking at. We're looking at the developed world that has had a fairly stable demographic burden over the last 30 years. And that's about to change in the next few years. We're getting old, and that will change where we have to spend our money on healthcare, etc. On the other hand, the developing world has at least another 20 to 30 years where the population will continue to be fairly young, and they will have the opportunity to use a younger workforce and increase also their competitiveness. In Maersk, or in the A.P. Møller Group, I should say, we have found 15 of these markets that we have said, well, for our global future, we need to be in those markets, and we have a VP, executive VP in Copenhagen responsible for each of these markets to ensure that we actually develop as we should be, and we are present in those markets. Sometimes you don't really know where it's going to head, but one of the examples is that this week we have a team led by one of our VPs in Myanmar. Now, that's a stretch probably today, but in the years to come, you don't know. We'll see in the next 12 months probably what happens in the democratic process, but that is at least one of the markets also that we will be looking at. Another interesting trend is, of course, what are the population going to look like? India will soon surpass China. China will be number one 50 years from now. Nigeria is likely to surpass the US, so don't forget Africa in this game as well. Consumption, where is it going? Well, it is, of course, still the developed world, and it will for time to come. What we have seen, and that number is, of course, also in debate, but around $6,000 per capita is where consumption really takes off. And that was what happened in Korea in the 80s. It was what was seen in Brazil about 6 years ago. And it is what is probably happening in China very soon, in as much as the Chinese population is aging, and that's the breaking point. It is in the next debatable 1 to 5 years probably. But other markets that hasn't really shown their real potential yet are India, Indonesia, etc. that will only come there in the years to come. Indonesia has a population of 250 million, of which already today, by Indonesian standards, 120 million is considered middle class. So a significant market also to consider there. Everybody talks about China. I'm sorry, I can't leave it out as well. Both as a buying power import, certainly, but also when we talk about transportation. It is the main engine in Asia, and it will continue to be so for many years to come. What we have seen is, of course, is a shift from the Pearl River Delta and the Hong Kong area up the coast to Shanghai, or even more up towards the north, and in towards Chongqing, etc. This is based on cost of establishing on the coastal side, and of course, labor in the interior. At the same time, this is only one of the shifts. What we are also seeing is a rapid shift towards Southeast Asia. We are seeing Indonesia, we are seeing Vietnam, we are seeing Cambodia, seeing Bangladesh as some of the markets that are coming up from a production perspective. These are, of course, some of the less advanced projects. It will typically be textiles and so on that is moving. But salaries in Indonesia are less than half of what they are in China today. The same goes for Bangladesh. And if we look at Myanmar, which was another example, we can expect that those salaries are less than half of what they are in Indonesia. So if somebody succeeds, there's also 50 million plus people in Myanmar, fairly well educated. So there's also an opportunity there, hopefully over the years to come. That said, the output in China is enormous today. But as an example, if I can just say that what we saw in 2011 was towards Europe, which is for us the biggest trade. We saw an almost flat growth, a few percent in the southern part, and we saw this part growing by about 20%. So it's a significant shift that we are seeing in the years as we go right now. I've only taken one market. I haven't taken what is today the focus, the Asia-Europe. But this is from the Asian part and trying to illustrate with numbers why Europe and the US should be careful not to think that we are the center of the universe and why we could be marginalized. This is how the trade outlook from our perspective in containerized transportation looks today. And what I have taken out here as a piece of the pie is the intra-Asia trade. That is the biggest trade for the Asian countries. This is just the containerized. Obviously, there's cross-border as well, but a lot of containerized. And what we often talk about, well, the market to North America is huge for containers, and it is to Europe, but this is where we see the growth, and we are seeing double-digit growth every year. And this part we are seeing, if any, very, very marginal growth this year. So this is where we think we need to be present also in the future. This is where we also believe that all Scandinavian companies has an opportunity, and I think also it may be a bit dramatic to call it survival, but this is where things are going to happen in the future. I only have one last slide, because I also wanted to touch upon infrastructure and hopefully also bring it a little bit back to Sweden. This is a picture from Africa, but it goes for a lot of the world. In India, 4% of business owners believe they have adequate infrastructure, not just transportation, to actually support their business development. So this is significant. It's a lot better in China, where I think up to more than 80% actually believe they have adequate standards. This is really bad in Russia as well, and I wouldn't even talk about Africa, where this is also a stumbling block. So if Indonesia, that has a growth of 6 to 7% a year, want to develop in the future, they really need to get their act together and their investments. Today, in our industry, they can handle very small container ships. In Jakarta, they have a lot of small ports, and they can get no efficiency. They can't even access the port. The good news is, of course, something can be done about it. We have seen in Nigeria 6 years ago, container vessels were waiting 20, 30 days outside the port with a concerted effort on investments, also with foreign direct investments. That waiting time has actually in 6 years been brought down to less than a day. So there is a need, a possibility to do something about this. This also goes for Scandinavia. And the reason I'm bringing this point up is probably because as late as 2 weeks ago, I was on a tour of Sweden, and I met quite a few local politicians, and I met a few what we call depot owners, container depot owners, and logistics facilities. And I'm sure if we look out here, also there will be a lot of exhibitions displaying a map of Sweden that is centered in different locations. So what I experienced was a very, very defragmented approach to the infrastructural development in Sweden. And I think it's scary. A lot of these local politicians, they had a belief, we build something, we are the center of Sweden, and they will come. And those investments, while short-term are good for us as transport buyers, we can get something really cheap, but long-term for Sweden, it's going to ruin competitiveness. So my message here, which I also hope we can talk a little bit about later, is, well, we need infrastructure, we need good infrastructure, but we also need it to be coordinated on a national level. That was what I had.
Thank you very much, Christian. Yes, let me move you here to this table here, yes. And let me ask you other 5 presenters to come up on stage, and we'll go on with the discussion. While you are moving up on stage, I want to ask you, Christian, you said here, you said in the beginning of your presentation that maybe the big companies like yours and the other ones here on stage, they already have focus on these emerging markets, but you feel also that many smaller and medium-sized companies maybe are not looking in the right direction?
I think they are, but not fast enough. I think meeting some of the companies, which was also presented, the European market is still extremely important for most Scandinavian companies. And to a large extent, they can still sell most of their product there. But getting across to Asia and Africa is a challenge if you're a small company to put the resources towards finding agents or partners or even just get people down there to look at it and getting the experience, because they're a difficult market to operate in. Both Southeast Asia as well as Africa are some of the most challenging markets as we see it today.
So if you're a small or medium-sized company wanting to go to these markets you're telling us about, do you have the strength? What are you supposed to do?
Well, I don't know if I have the full answer, but I've been to a couple of exhibitions, amongst others, with Norwegian exhibitionists, and they have an active Innovation Norway, which at least at those occasions, I don't know the full scope of what they are set in the world to do, but at least at those exhibitions, I saw them taking a very active role for smaller Norwegian companies, helping them with their